Okay.
Excellent. Well,
Hi.
thank you, Alan, so much for agreeing to do this interview with for my Countdown to the Moon project. Um, I've of course read See You in Orbit, which I think is a fantastic book. I recommend it to anybody who has an interest in actual general people going into space and sort of the journey that we've taken so far, and you're a part of that. And could you say a few words about yourself?
Sure. I've been happily retired for about 7 years from NASA headquarters. I was fortunate over my 40-year aerospace career to work at NASA 3 times as a civil servant in the 80s, as a political appointee in the 90s, and then under President Clinton, and then as a political appointee under President Obama. In the 80s, as a civil servant, I had a chance to be the manager of the Spaceflight Participant Program. And that's where we attempted to put, or we had planned to put, civilians on space shuttle flights, perhaps as many as 3 or 4 a year. The teacher in space was selected as the first category. Journalist in space was the ongoing competition at the time of the Challenger accident. The third category we were looking at, but hadn't made an actual decision, was to have an artist. And we were struggling a bit to figure out, well, how do you pick an artist and who's the right group to work with to make that determination? So having had that experience, I got all the letters from people that dreamed of flying in space and volunteered to be on a shuttle mission. And I got them from kids as young as 6 to adults as old as 90. And everybody had their reason why I should look no further, because they were the one. Even when we had the teacher and journalist program going, it didn't stop people from writing to see could they go anyway. So because of all those letters, because I saw the dream that everybody had, it inspired me to write a book about the history. And what made us think that we were all going to get to fly in space? Well, it's because for the past 70 years, the media, aerospace companies, government officials, visionaries have all said that our ticket to ride was just a rocket away, and that space tourism was going to be prevalent. We'd all get to go. And it was backed up by things like Space Shuttle. Initially, it was supposed to fly 60 times a year. It would only need 3 astronauts. There'd be 4 seats for passengers. Of course, that didn't quite pan out that way. There were other private companies that came along in the 90s that wanted to lease space on a shuttle and put seats in the cargo bay that people could sit in. There were private companies that wanted to have their own spacecraft they were going to build, and for $50,000 would fly you around the Earth 5 times. So this has been something that's been our psyche, and more evidence of why people wanted to go. In 1968, a year before we landed on the moon the first time, Pan American Airways created what they called the First Moon Flights Club. And this was to make a reservation to fly to the moon. Over a 3-year period, they got over 93,000 people apply. So it showed something about the interest that was there. Of course, eventually Pan Am couldn't even shuttle from DC to New York, much less to the moon. But people used to send me their membership card to see if they could trade that in for a shuttle flight. Likewise, in 1950, the the Hayden Planetarium in New York City had a lecture on the conquest of space by historian Willie Ley. They set up an interplanetary tour reservation book in the booth in the lobby, and you could sign out a form. Where do you want to go? The moon, Saturn, Mars, Venus. Estimated time of departure, 1975. Over the next 3 years, 22,000 people filled out that application, and they got a reservation card, and those people sent me the cards in the 1980s to cash that in. So clearly, this is a dream that's been with us for decades. I mean, even going back to Robert Goddard, he got hundreds of letters from people to volunteer to fly in his moon rocket that hadn't even been built yet. So he was, by the way, a little annoyed by all of these letters. He wanted to focus on his research, and he was kind of put off by all the people volunteering. So now we're finally to the period where maybe it looks like tourism will become a reality. Granted, in the near term, it's going to be for people of wealth, because at $250,000 for a suborbital ride or $50 million to go to the space station, there's not going to be a large pool of people. There'll be plenty of people that will want to do it. So those of us of more modest means are going to have to wait a while till that dream comes through. But I try to tell people that maybe through things like corporate sponsorships, contests, and what have you, or organizations like Space for Humanity that wants to fly 10,000 people at no cost, and no cost to them, perhaps some of us will get to fly that way. So it's a dream that's endured. It's a dream that will continue. And of course, we all have our fingers crossed that it might start as early as later this year.
It's really an exciting time. I am personally very excited about potentially getting to go into space, and the potential that when a whole wide range of people get that experience, that they start to see, you know, how special Earth is. So you have like the Earth Day phenomenon, but then also kind of how small Earth is and how big maybe the rest of the solar system is, and maybe we should get out there and explore it a little bit more.
Yeah, yeah.
But I've been going out and interviewing everyday people, you know, people at coffee shops, in the mall, on the buses, you know, just like random people. You're actually, I purposely try to avoid space people to try to get kind of thoughts of like the common person. And so my sample set is not scientific, but one thing I've noticed is sort of a generational divide between people who are excited about going to space and people who haven't. Kind of to this point, I interviewed a mother-daughter. The daughter was 18, I think, and then the mother was probably in her 40s, I would say. And my final question I usually ask people is, if it was safe and affordable, would you have an interest in going to space? And the mother is like, absolutely. And the daughter is like, no. And the mother was actually
Oh, interesting.
surprised by the daughter's answer. You know, it was really kind of captured, and you know, it's just one data point, so not kind of like a good cross sectional study of the population or anything. The other thing is, I think there might be kind of a wealth gap, a societal wealth gap between people who are excited by space and people who aren't. I think teenagers in America feel very insular and conservative in many respects, but then kids in, say, Mexico seem very excited about the idea that they could go out into space. And I was just wondering, based upon your experience over maybe the past couple of decades, have you noticed these shifts? Are these maybe, I mean, is there like any data that you've seen that would either support or refute sort of like those generalizations?
Well, it's been a while. First of all, it's okay to interview me as, even though I'm a space person, because as I get older, I become more of a cynical space person. Because you have to remember, I was in the Office of Exploration at NASA in 1987 when it first started as a recommendation from the Sally Ride Leadership in Space report. And we were then under President George H.W. Bush, and he came out with his vision about space, to go back to the moon to stay, on to Mars, build the space station, yada, yada, yada. And then when somebody said, well, what that's going to cost, a 90-day study was done, and it was tagged with the number 500 billion. So that program was dead on arrival just because of that number. And to our defense back then, we included run-out cost over a long period of time. So the lesson there is, if you want to get this thing approved at the beginning, maybe you hold back a little on the run-out cost, because if you did that with all government programs, we wouldn't fund anything. And so that's why I'm a little bit amused now, where NASA has been asked repeatedly, well, how much is the Artemis program going to cost. And even on today's press conference, where they announced the lunar lander 3 contractors, they were still a little vague on what the numbers were. But they did say, hey, they get $3 billion extra to go towards a lunar lander. So I guess that's a good thing. In terms of data on support and interest, Sally Ride and I actually did a look-see at all the polls that have been done from the 60s through the 80s. And polling on space has been fairly consistent over a long period of time. There's great interest in space. There's a great misunderstanding about how much NASA's budget is. That has been consistent over a 50-year period. Younger people, I always thought younger people tend to be a little more in favor of space, especially what is now called the Artemis generation, the space generation. All the young people I interact with recently at conferences and different talks I've done to promote the book, young people seem very interested. More senior people in my demographic, we're of the Apollo era. And so space to us was a big thing when it started. It was new. It was something different. It was a way to get national patriotism going and accomplishment. And so those people remain interested. And the problem I think we're going to have is now, especially with this pandemic, and despite Jim Bridenstine's optimism during the press conference that, well, he didn't think this, the problem with the budgets now was going to hurt NASA. I hope that's true. But I think once people start with the comparison, the old, well, if you can spend money on this, why can't we spend money on that? So do we really need to be spending money to get back to the moon by 2024 when so many people are hurting and are out of work? It's a much tougher argument today than it has been in the past because of the pandemic, because so many people are unemployed, because so many people are hurting financially. So then to come along and say, oh, but hey, we're going to spend X billions of dollars to get to the moon in the next 5 years or 4 years, that's going to fall a little flat, I think. Likewise, when they start flying suborbital flights, I think there's going to be the normal pushback of, well, this is something for the wealthy. Why should we care about this? But that's like any major transportation system, has always been expensive at the beginning before it became more affordable for the masses. I think in this case, we keep hearing about how, if the price could come down to $50,000, that's the equivalent to taking a trip to climb Mount Everest in the Himalayas, because that's a cost of about $50,000 to $75,000, and lots of people do that, and people die, and people go do it anyway. On the other hand, at a recent conference, I thought I heard somebody say that suborbital tourism is likely to increase in price in the near term rather than decrease. So I think we're a long way from that the $50,000 figures. That's like the holy grail of space tourism. But who knows? I hope somebody makes it. And I'll tell you what I do get enthused about, Nick, and that is when I go out to talks and the young people are there, I do lose some of my cynicism. I do get re-inspired because I think, boy, that's how I used to be when I first got into space. I was excited. No holds barred. We can do anything. When I was the manager of the Shuttle Student Involvement Project, I put high school student experiments on the shuttle. And we sent the first 10 winners out of the Johnson Space Center to start getting them integrated onto mission. And we got this note back from JSC that said, well, you don't actually intend to fly these things, do you? And we said, well, yeah, that was the whole purpose. And they said, well, we got these other things to do, blah, 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 blah. You got to go through safety. So General James Abramson, who was running the shuttle program at the time, and to his credit, they handed us these safety packets that were, this thick with things you had to do. And we said, God, these are high school student experiments. It can't be that hard. So Abramson tasked me and some people at JSC to reduce the paperwork required. And we did get it down substantially. They still went through safety reviews. They still had to do all the right things, but it wasn't this documentation nightmare for a high school student. So we went ahead, and you wouldn't believe how hard it was to get student experiments on the shuttle. And I think I kept going forward because what I didn't know what I didn't know. I kept saying to myself, how hard can this be? Not understanding this bureaucracy of paperwork and requirements that were behind the curtain, if you will. And years later, I commented to somebody, I said, you know what? I don't think I would even start this program now, knowing what I know of how hard it could be. I just didn't have it in me anymore. So I'm inspired by young people and maybe members of the of your Space Society chapter down in Texas that are going to bring these fresh ideas that have the enthusiasm, that haven't been beaten down by the system yet. And so I look forward to some very great things. I also think the big difference now from what it was when I was in that original Office of Exploration is that we now have the commercial sector heavily involved. You've got the innovative companies like Blue Origin, SpaceX, I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank on the third one that got the contract today. Dynetics.
Dynetics, yeah.
Yeah, and companies like that, Maston Aerospace. These people are really doing what commercial space needs to do to help us explore the moon and beyond. And or universities like the Astrobotics program at Carnegie Mellon. All those things I think are tremendously exciting. I think are going to have a major play in the future. And maybe they can find ways to help us get past some of these temporary problems we're facing now, be they budgetary or political, and hit that 2024 date. I admire your tweets every day when you say how many days it is until we land on the moon. And part of me says, oh, I don't think that's going to happen. But this other part of me says, boy, I hope you're so right. And I'm so glad that you have that enthusiasm and faith in the program that we can, in fact, accomplish such goals.
And let's see, you mentioned like the third group that you were thinking about sending was artists. And, I think ideally, we could only send a limited number of people at a time. And we would want to send people that would be able to share that experience in the deepest, richest, and most impactful way with a broad set of people. So you may send one person, but it feels like millions went with them.
Exactly.
And sending, teachers, that made sense because you had they can share that experience with their classmates and everything. Journalists, they're already communicating out stuff, and artists are communicating out on a big, broad, emotional and things that may be, in their own special way. I was wondering what your thoughts were on the whole Dear Moon project of sending a group of artists around the moon on a SpaceX rocket.
Yeah, I think that's very exciting. In fact, I tried to contact some of the artists that had communicated with me back in the 80s to let them know about that program to see if, maybe they would want to apply. Of course, they were like me. They were in their 40s back then. We're all old farts now. But I think it's very exciting. I hope it goes through. I heard different rumors that the Japanese billionaire that was going to pay for that mission was having some financial difficulties. But let's hope that he has found a way to continue. I haven't heard anything about his selection process. I thought it was supposed to have started in the winter of this past year. Maybe that's been pushed back a little bit. The date seems to move around a little bit. The one time I saw it was 2022. I'm a little skeptical about that date until I see more success from the Starship program, but that doesn't mean it won't happen. Elon's got a pretty decent track record of success, not always on the schedule, he says. He uses the phrase I like, the aspirational goals. which is a way of saying, well, we'll do it when we can do it. But I think that sending 8 artists would be pretty significant, because the other part of that program was then those artists would be obligated to spend, I think it was at least a year, to travel around the world and talk about their experience, to share the art that they created. And so that would be a fabulous way to go. It's also nice that it's being done in the private sector, because they can do what they want. In the government, we had some real constraints on how we go about doing that. First of all, we could only pick one. Then there was, well, what organization would help us make that selection? For the teachers, we had the Council of Chief State School Officers, the head education official in each state. The journalists, we had the Association of Deans of Schools of Journalism and Mass Communication. For the artists, there isn't a single overarching organization that kind of represents all artists. I began talking to the National Endowment of Arts. They were very intrigued and wanted to help. We, of course, would have talked to curators of museums, different arts organizations, but then it got to be, boy, how do you even narrow that down? You know, it was easy to figure out who's a professional journalist, who's a professional teacher, who's a professional artist. I mean, I do art on the side. Would I have been eligible? Do you do, you know, would it have been photography? Would it have been painters? Would it have been sculptors? It was really a lot to try to chew on. And then, of course, the accident occurred and it was dead on arrival. So we didn't pursue it anymore. But it would have been a fascinating way to go forward. One suggestion that had some merit was, we'll only allow those artists that participated in the NASA art program that had started in the 60s and certainly ran through the shuttle program. It may still be going on now, I'm not sure. But these were artists that received a small stipend from NASA, would attend launches, would go to training program or training sessions of astronauts, would go to the factory floor, and they would create art about what they saw and communicate that. And I thought they had a pretty good rationale for why they should be the ones picked, especially because it would made our selection pool much smaller. But then we heard from other artists that said, well, I didn't participate in the NASA art program, but why shouldn't I be able to apply to this? So the long and short to your question is, I think the program with the Japanese billionaire, who, by the way, has I believe, sponsors an art foundation, will be a fabulous thing, and I do hope it happens.
Right, and exactly what do you consider to be art? The definition that he is using is like a very broad one, going from, you know, of course, your visual artists, your musicians, your film directors, your writers, right, all the way to like fashion designers and, you know, just like anything you want to call art, it looks like is up for the running.
Yeah. Well, the selection process is going to be something, I'll tell you that. I haven't read much lately about how they're going to do that once people apply. I would assume they will get thousands of applications. You know, I don't think that's an exaggeration. I mean, we just had, what was it, 12,000 people applied to be an astronaut at NASA. The last time around, 18,000 applied. Artists, I think, are very prevalent around the world. It's not just one country. You don't have to be an American to apply for this program with the Japanese billionaire. But he will have his work cut out for him. And I should probably follow up on that, see how he's doing with his selection process, because I'd be fascinated to learn how he's going to go about doing that. With 8 seats, he can certainly have a wide range of venues to choose from. So at least I think a lot of different types of art will be represented.
And, you know, it may be far easier for him than it would be for another program, because, you know, that phrase, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Art, what's good art versus bad, I mean, is a very controversial, difficult to pin down thing. And you know, whenever you have like a publicly funded program, or even a program that's funded by a group of people, trying to define what's good art may seem like an impossible task, but in a program where it's funded by a single individual, you could almost just say who has the most impact on him.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's, as I say, he's a major art collector, so he knows what he likes, and I think he'll do a fine job of setting up the appropriate criteria.
I had an idea that I feel like all the people that I know, you would be able to give me the most insightful feedback on this idea. So I was thinking that if you were looking at trying to send a small group of people into space to have an experience of seeing Earth from above, the weightlessness, the blackness of space, and to have that experience both be impactful and meaningful to that individual's life, as well as having it transmitted in a very powerful way to a larger group of people. A group that you might consider would be high school students, because these are kids that have been in contact with their peers for about a decade, are having, they're in they have a lot of time to communicate with each other and what have you. And they're also at that pivotal moment where they're kind of looking at their options and having to reconsider some of their childhood dreams and get real about their career. And, just that little extra stimulus about, you really can go off and do these things might have a huge impact. And so I was actually thinking of, instead of taking astronauts and having them visit the high schools, why not take a high school student, potentially from every high school, and give them the astronaut experience and then put them back in that high school? And I was wondering what you, putting aside the financial and practicalities of that, and just thinking about the social impact, what's your thoughts?
When you say the astronaut experience, you mean actually flying in space?
Exactly.
Okay. Well, first of all, I have a soft spot in my heart for student programs. That's how I got my start in space advocacy. My first job at NASA was putting high school student experiments on the shuttle. But even before the high school program was formed, I was at an organization in the 70s called FAST, Forum for the Advancement of Students in Science and Technology. And Leonard David was there. He was in charge of our aerospace program. Many of you know Leonard is one of the great aerospace reporters of today. And we were pushing a college student program for the shuttle. Now, this was in the 1976-77 period. So the shuttle is still being developed. It's behind schedule. It's over budget. And we're parading up and down the halls of NASA trying to promote a student program. And that's the last thing they wanted to talk about at that time. It wasn't their priority. But there was a hearing in the Senate about it. We had a lot of support for it. And even James Fletcher, the administrator at the time, responded to a senator who was writing to him on our behalf. And Fletcher said, it's conceivable to me that someday students could fly in the shuttle as payload specialists. So this idea has been around for a long time. Even at the beginning of the spaceflight participant program, major aerospace executives like Sanford McDonald from McDonnell Douglas tried to put the bug in the ear of James Begg, the NASA administrator at the time, who just recently passed away, that we should fly a Boy Scout. And the columnist Jack Anderson was promoting that as well. So there was some movement that, well, maybe we should fly somebody as young as a Boy Scout. At that time, it was felt that flying somebody that young, we just didn't have enough information. It was too soon. Now I think you could probably make a case for students, especially because so many students have been involved with so much hands-on development of space hardware, of communication systems, of actual exploration vehicles that are going around that are managed out of universities. Whether or not the high school student or college student, I won't fall on my sword either way on that. I think either one is fine. I will say that you don't, if you make that commitment though, you got to move out on it while they're still in that age group. Some of our high school students were selected when they were 15 and 16 years old for the shuttle student involvement program and didn't fly their experiment till they were in their 20s because it took so long. So I think flying, my feeling is no matter who goes, I don't care if it's younger people, older people, the fact that you have a broader range of demographics from just engineering and science-oriented people. And a lot of astronauts do a great job of communicating, some better than others. But I think what the public wants to see is they don't see themselves in the astronauts necessarily. I think they certainly saw themselves teachers saw themselves in Krista McCall. Journalists would have seen themselves with whatever journalists were selected. So I think once you are able to broaden the types of people that go, you can get a revived interest and get new points of view on what is the experience about. I got started in the space program in 1969 with a group called the Committee for the Future that was run by Barbara Hubbard and Colonel John Whiteside. And their idea at the time was new worlds on Earth, new worlds in space, new worlds on Earth. And Barbara believed that through space travel, we would have a rising in consciousness. We would go up what she called the evolutionary spiral, where you would have new ways of thinking, new ways of looking. And I think we've seen a bit of that through the overview effect that Frank White has written so eloquently about, and Ron Guerin has written about in his book, Orbital Perspective. And what you have there is that when people go into space and they look back at Earth, they don't see the borders, they see the oneness of humanity, and it changes the way they think about things. I think if we get more and more people to fly in space and have that kind of experience, then maybe in fact we could have an evolution of consciousness, which is the reason I got involved in space from the beginning.
I mean, indeed. I mean, nobody goes. I have yet to hear an astronaut remark about how beautiful the borders are between the various countries.
Right. Except, and the one thing they do comment on is the Chinese, the Great Wall of China, but that's about it.
Yeah, it's and also, I mean, from the moon, being able to see the Earth and put your thumb up and completely cover it. I mean, it's something that I think people have a lot of trouble relating to. But even if you had a couple of dozen people with that experience, I think they would be able to communicate a lot better and be a lot more impactful.
Well, and the other interesting point is that will you get that kind of overview orbital perspective from a suborbital flight? Because it's a short flight. It's not, you're not going to be floating very long. What is it? Maybe 6 to 8 minutes. I keep seeing this range of minutes. You're going to be focused on the enjoyment and the exhilaration of weightlessness. I doubt you're going to be spending too much time looking out the window. You will be able to see the curvature of the Earth, but will that be enough to give you that conscious shift the way Apollo era astronauts got from looking back at the Earth from a greater distance or from the moon? Shuttle astronauts, I think to a certain extent, many of them seem to have shared that orbital perspective, so I think that's good. So we'll have to wait and see. I did ask Beth Moses from Virgin Galactic that question at a conference recently out in Colorado, and she felt that she did experience it. So that, who am I to say she did or didn't, that she believes that you can have that from a suborbital flight. I hope that's the case. And again, hearing what those people think when they come back is going to be helpful for all of us to understand the space experience.
Well, and I think there's a little bit of fear with space travel as well. So suborbital flights could be a good way to start making people more comfortable with taking bigger journeys, or at least to get them started.
Yeah, well, let's be realistic. Space is a dangerous business. Astronauts have died. One commercial pilot died during the test. People have died on the ground during operations. So, but then people have also died climbing Mount Everest, as I said earlier. And that hasn't stopped people from wanting to go and experience that. I think the difference will be, for example, when SpaceX and Boeing start flying NASA astronauts, and God forbid an accident happens and an astronaut dies, how will the public respond to that? I mean, it was a great national mourning when the Challenger accident happened, when the Columbia accident happened, when the Virgin Galactic pilot died. That was in a few news cycles, but then it kind of went away. It didn't seem to have the impact on the national psyche the way having so many astronauts die. So if private people are harmed in some way through space travel, will that impact the public consciousness, or will people feel like, hey, they had consent, they knew what they were signing up for, sorry it happened, but we're going to keep going forward. So that will be interesting to see in the years ahead, and let's hope that that first accident happens much later than sooner.
Yeah, and it could be just a numbers thing. You know, whenever you have like 7 Mercury astronauts and they're like held up as being you know, superheroes, for something to happen to one of them is a lot more impactful than having an astronaut corps of several hundred astronauts. Or, you know, if you have thousands or millions of people traveling each year and, you know, a couple of them have a bad experience.
Yeah.
So out of all the people that I've interviewed so far, I've done about 135.
Wow.
Yeah.
You gonna write a book?
I don't know. Right now it's just trying to keep up with the daily interview. I feel like if I skip a day, the world will like collapse or something. So a lot of pressure. But out of all the people I've interviewed, I would say only about 15 of them knew that we were going back to the moon in 2024. And you know, is there something that NASA should be doing now to get the word out, or will it just naturally occur as we make progress? I mean, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a great question. I spoke last fall, winter, out at the Griffin Observatory in Los Angeles. They invited me to come and talk about my book during a 50th anniversary of Apollo 12. And it seems a little odd that I was there talking about space tourism when they were talking about Apollo 12, but the unique thing that Laura Danley, the curator, did was had me talk about what was being said about space tourism during the Apollo 12 era. So that made a great link. And we started off that session by asking for a show of hands of the audience, and it was a fairly full auditorium, how many people were aware of the Artemis program. And it was a pathetically low number of people that raised their hand. So, you know, I was at NASA in the Office of Communications. I was the head of public outreach with my last position. We did everything to get the word out about NASA. We did exhibits. We did astronaut visits. We did send NASA people out to speak at schools and civics groups. The NASA news side of the house puts out their press releases and videos, and has, especially popular is the NASA tweet ups. NASA Communications has received awards for the things they've done, and yet nothing seems to be moving this needle of people being aware of the Artemis program. I'm not quite sure what that's all about. I think there's so many other things going on right now. There's so much going on with Blue Origin, with SpaceX, with Boeing, with other companies, with things happening, that it's hard for people that aren't hardcore space advocates that watch the program every day. I think it's just hard for them to keep up. And so, you know, where do we hear about the Artemis program? How often is Artemis talked about on television news or in the newspapers? I mean, there'll be an occasional article here and there. Hopefully this announcement from today will get some press coverage. Maybe it'll be on the nightly news tonight. which I think would be a good thing. But we're still a ways from that public acceptance or public awareness of the way they were during Apollo. And even after Apollo, even after the first Apollo flight, that public interest dropped off rapidly. It was like, okay, we did that. Why should we do any more? So NASA certainly has stepped up to the challenge. I think they've done a lot of things to get the word out. Certainly, SpaceX and Blue Origin have captured the public imagination. I think they've filled a void, or I shouldn't say void. They have filled an audience that NASA hadn't reached before. It's very exciting what Elon Musk does. He's a natural attractor of publicity, except when he says stupid things like the coronavirus, the COVID virus is a hoax, or we shouldn't worry about it. But he gets a lot of attention. Richard Branson gets a lot of attention. Jeff Bezos gets a lot of attention. And they are kind of the individual faces, the way Wernher von Braun was back during the Apollo program. They are faces that people can start to relate to. So if they do more to talk about Artemis, if they do more to talk about the importance of getting back to the moon and then going on to Mars, maybe you'll start to get that increase in public awareness. But beyond that, I'm not quite sure what else NASA can do. They've got a full agenda. And by the way, for space advocates to understand, you'll always hear, well, why isn't NASA doing TV programs? Well, we can't, or NASA can't. If NASA starts to get too involved in publicity, too involved in promotion, then Congress comes down on and says, well, that's not the government role. You're not supposed to do that. So all they can do is make their material and data available, and then let the private sector come in and use that to create educational information, movies, TV series. Unfortunately, other than a few movies that we can name off the top of our heads, I can't think of any TV series that have really been successful in capturing what the space exploration is all about or has sustained public interest.
It's interesting you mentioned the nightly news. And I think back to when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were first stepping onto the lunar surface. We had 3 network TV stations all playing that moment. Everybody was reading the same newspapers, everybody was reading the same magazines. And today, we don't have that same news setup. I mean, I don't watch the nightly news. In fact, I don't watch TV. I watch Amazon and Netflix, and it has no ads on it. Most of what I get in terms of news is online. And the thing about the online news is what I see versus what somebody else sees is very, very, very different. So all the NASA stuff comes to me because I click on it, and that changes the algorithm for what I get. And so I see more and more NASA stuff. So whenever people are like, hey, NASA should do social media, and like, they're doing nothing but social media. In fact, nobody else is doing social media. But on their
Webby Awards.
Yeah, exactly. And then on their feed, they don't see anything about NASA. They see something about whatever they're interested in.
Right.
And I mean, it seems like this is a problem bigger than the NASA are getting people to know about going to Artemis. This is a problem about we all fundamentally live in completely different worlds from each other. And it's almost like there's no foundation for us to actually have conversations with each other because we live in our own worlds. And I mean, kind of not a space thing, but a human thing. I was wondering what your thoughts were there.
That's a great observation. I hadn't really thought of it that way, but this is probably a misuse of the term, but you hear a lot these days about tribalism. Maybe there is an aspect of a type of tribalism that, the space community, space advocates, we're in our own little tribe, we're our own little interest. Whereas people that are more interested in ecology, although space has a big role in ecology and environmental studies, that's over on the side. And they don't necessarily follow NASA unless somehow somebody from the space side is able to make a link to the environmental side or the ecology side and show them the benefits of what space research helps. And by the way, you were talking about public polls earlier. One of the areas that the public is most interested in for NASA is their Earth science research. And that is something that a lot of space advocates almost sigh when they see that, because it's like, oh, no, it's about human exploration. Well, you know what? For the general public, that isn't necessarily the case. And that polling data has been consistent for years, that's what people like about NASA is what they do for Earth science. Certain political parties aren't convinced of that and don't care about that, but that is true. So you've got these different pockets of interest, and because people don't watch, I mean, like Walter Cronkite was, how was he identified back then? He was the man you could trust. He was the man that everybody listened to, and when he cried when the Apollo 11 landed, we all cried with him, because that's how much influence he had. I think you're hard pressed to find any news organization or media company now that has that kind of impact on as many individuals as they did back then. I mean, there's all these pockets of interest, and certain reporters have their following and what have you. But you're exactly right. If you don't dedicate yourself to finding space news, it's not going to fall into your lap all that often through the traditional news sites. It just doesn't happen. And I watch the major news organizations. I still watch the networks because that's what I grew up with. And I watch the cable news stories. And you're hard pressed to find stories about the space program. I tried to get my book on some of these morning talk shows and struck out with every one of them. Although some astronauts have had luck appearing on those shows, I don't see them covering space the way they do other topics of interest to people.
Yeah, I almost think if we send a dog into space, we would get way more attention.
Yeah, well, the first dog did get a lot of attention.
I know. You start sending dogs and cats, be like, whoa,
Yeah.
that's
A
really
cat video in space would be something.
that would be something. Yeah. Well, today's announcement, I know you just found out about it right before we started chatting. I have my own feelings about it, but I was curious in what you thought.
I think it's interesting that there's three significantly different architectures, which I think is good, so that they can evaluate, do trade-off studies, what have you. There's what is it? Three stages, 2 stages, 1 stage, and so we'll see how they go. Evidently, there's sufficient funding to support their work over the next few years, so we'll see how that goes. I think, again, not to rain on your 2024 parade, but find me a major exploration system that has come in on its appropriate deadline. I mean, Apollo made it by 1 year, and that was even with an accident. So will these companies be able to get it together to get their landers built within the next 4 years? I hope so. I think it's a tall order, and I don't know how much work they've already done. So hopefully they've come a long ways already, and they'll be able to meet their deadline. I think the other part that then will raise public interest with those companies is there'll be something of a competition between them, and the public loves a little bit of a competition. So I think that's good. And if there are milestones along the way that are visible to show people, that's one thing that kept people interested in during Apollo's. You had the Gemini program that was demonstrating things that would be needed, be it the walk in space, the rendezvous, the connecting capsules, different things that they did. We haven't seen those kinds of milestone events as much lately. So perhaps these folks, the 3 companies, can demonstrate things along the way to get the public interest, to excite people about it. So I think that part is good. I like the fact that there seemed to be enough money for 3. You know, normally if you can get 2, that's the best you can do. So we'll see. And they're not I mean, some of them have traditional partners, but isn't it interesting that the 3 leads are not your old line space companies, that they're the ones that are seen as innovative. I don't like the term new space because then that implies old space. I think that would be inaccurate to describe somebody like Northrop Grumman as just old space. I mean, I think they've been doing some pretty innovative things lately. I say that as somebody that worked there briefly, and I was impressed by their vision and what they wanted to accomplish. But they're part of that Blue Origin team, so they can bring some of that traditional stability and experience to Blue Origin's excitement and new way of doing things. So those are the kind of things that I think will be interesting. That's a pretty inside baseball game to be interested in that. I don't think the general public gives a damn about, oh, well, Northrop's old and Blue Origin's new, and it's nice that they're working together. I don't think anybody cares about that, except maybe you and I will, or your followers, because I do think that's going to be an interesting part of the story and part of the history of space exploration about how things have evolved.
Yeah, I mean, I almost think it's the difference between companies that exist to do the thing that they dream to do versus companies that exist to continue to make money. I mean, I almost feel like that's the distinction. And,
Yeah.
you know, at some point, these companies, if they're going to be successful, their dream is going to fall into the same kind of professional management type hands that optimize along those lines, and you'll have new dreamers come up, starting new companies that do other things. So
because you have such a long-term vision, and you initially said something about, well, what's the next 500 years of space look like? I can't get my head wrapped around it. That'd be like asking somebody from the 1500s of what America would be like today. But won't it be interesting when we evolve to the point where Blue Origin and Masten Aerospace and SpaceX are seen as old space?
Oh, right.
and are looked at as, oh, those old gladiators, those old codgers, they need to get right and do things in a new way. I think that's what will be fascinating. And won't that be a hell of a leap in the evolutionary spiral?
Oh, indeed. I mean, like IBM and then Microsoft. Now, Microsoft is like seen as being like, you know, established and old,
Right.
and now even Facebook is like old, you know. It's kind of, but that is interesting. So about the 500-year question, do you think in 500 years we'll have a city on Mars, people traveling to like the moons of Jupiter and Saturn?
I would be amazed if that didn't happen. I mean, that's a huge time frame. I mean, just look at what's happened in the last 100 years in terms of going from aviation to space exploration, from, you know, a computer, from astronauts going to the moon, and the fact that our iPhones have more computational power than they had. I mean, who knows where this is going to go? I would be very surprised if 500 years from now, you didn't have societies on other planetary bodies, or in, be it space stations, or, you know, some other, who knows what the new thing might be. There was a time when people thought Gerard O'Neill's concept of a space colony was crazy, and yet that could happen within the next, say, 100 years, certainly. You've got entire countries like the United Arab Emirates, a Middle East country that only has had a space program for the last 3 years or maybe 4 years. And they have this goal of having a community on Mars in the next 100 years. I mean, that's how far out they're looking. And they're starting with one orbiting spacecraft within the next year or so to go around Mars, but they already have their strategic plan looks out 100 years. Certainly the Japanese have been known for long-term thinking. That'd be a good question for you to ask somebody from the Japanese Space Agency about what are they doing. You know, in the late 80s, I had a chance to go to Tokyo to speak, and I was hosted at the Shimizu Construction Company. Shimizu builds all their hotels and buildings and what have you, but they had a space exploration unit, and they were looking at a space hotel. And this is back in the, I mean, it seems kind of blasé now, but let me tell you, back in 1986 when I went, it was pretty radical to talk about a space hotel. And they were already doing tests with materials, stress tests and the things that they were showing me. So they had a longer term vision. It wasn't 500 years, I don't think. It was like maybe 100 years. So I think maybe I would take this in more bite-sized pieces, if you don't mind. And I'm willing to go out 100 years and say that I do think there'll be some type of a livable situation or a habitat of some kind on Mars. How big, how many people, I don't know. I don't think it's going to be as inexpensive to get there as SpaceX has been claiming it's going to be, that all you have to do is sell your house and you can turn in your mortgage and go to Mars. I'm cynical on that. But over a 100-year period, who knows? And as transportation advances, as propulsion systems advance, you know, once you get beyond going from talking about an 8-month mission to Mars down to a 1 month, or whatever some of those more innovative concepts are with new kinds of engines and the things that Franklin Chang Diaz is working on, his Vasimir engine. If some of those things can be scaled up to take humans, you know, then I think all kinds of possibilities will happen. And then married along with that is all the other technologies advances here on Earth that will be able to support those types of exploration dreams.
Yeah, I mean, that would be fantastic if that works out like that. I mean, and you know, the thing is, whenever we went to the moon in 1969, world population was about what, 3 billion people, and now we're close to 7.
Right.
I mean, that's double the number of brains working
Yep.
on problems. And not only that, you know, how much of those 3 billion people's hours were spent just providing for their daily life and getting caught up on stuff, I feel like as a percentage, or, you know, the vast majority of the world's population is not, you know, spending time and effort on producing food, you know, shelter, and, you know, all those basic necessities. So this is one last little area to explore. I feel like there's so much human potential, but we don't necessarily see evidence of it because it feels like that either it's disconnected from, you know, because of poverty or lack of infrastructure or lack of education or, you know, laws and what have you. And then a lot of it seems to be netted out, like human effort and energy that's actually doing nothing but netting out another set of human energy. And it's like we're like playing tug of war, and it doesn't matter how many players you have, as long as if both sides are relatively equal, you never move in any direction. I mean, from your experience, would this describe kind of like the way you see the human condition, in the sense that we're not making full benefit of our capabilities? And if so, what do you think needs to change in order to kind of unleash that energy and capability?
I don't have a lot of experience in this, but I would think that one requirement is to have a shared goal, to have something that people can all get behind, that they believe in. Now, just within the space community itself, look at the last 40 years. It's been moon first. No, Mars, skip the moon. We'll get stuck there. Go to Mars. So the moon program that G.W.H. Bush wanted to get going gets shoved aside for a few years. Then they come back and the Stafford report kind of pushes the moon to the background, says, no, Mars should be the focus. Then the Clinton administration comes along and says, well, we're going to focus on the space station because that's affordable. We need to do something to promote international cooperation. by the way, my harangue for the past 20 years has been the International Space Station Partnership deserves the Nobel Peace Prize, because we've had this experience of working with many countries over all these years, never any major issues or problems between countries. And even when there have been political differences on Earth, it hasn't hurt what we've been doing on the space station. But that's for another argument for another day. So, but Clinton was more focused on the space station. You didn't really see much talk about Moon and Mars other than robotics things on Mars. Then we come along, and my last iteration at NASA under Obama was Journey to Mars. That was the hashtag, Journey to Mars. Mars, we're going to Mars. Well, then, change of administration comes, and somebody puts the bug in Trump's ear that, oh, we're going to go back to the moon. And he says, yeah, we're going to go back to the moon. We're going to do it in my second term. And then one day he's a freelance thinking, or maybe Buzz Aldrin got a hold of him and put a bug in his ear and says, oh, we've been to the moon. Let's go to Mars. And then he said, yeah, we should go to Mars. And then that confuses everybody who's been working about it. What, are we changing directions again? So there's a problem with our own community to focus on the shared objective, the shared goal that we can all get behind. Now, it seems lately, maybe Artemis is the thing that people are willing to get behind. It depends. I think to get the space science community involved in that will depend on how much science you can do on the moon to get them interested and become a stakeholder. But if we don't get our act together internally first, how do we expect the general public to understand or have awareness of Artemis or of any other things that NASA wants to do if we can't even agree amongst ourselves? So to get to your point about kind of wasted energy, it's wasted energy if everybody's out doing their own thing. I mean, maybe it's not wasted. It's they're focused on doing different things that they want to do, which I guess is good. But if you want to do these big, major earth-changing concepts or earth-changing ways of doing things, you've got to have a goal that you can get everybody behind. And if it's going to be Artemis, then I see a lot more work has to be done to make that happen.
Right. Yeah, I think the idea that we could recreate that worldwide moment whenever Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong landed on the moon and everybody was like solid and was in tune with it. I think recreating that globally. Yes, every news outlet, people were tuned in with shortwave radios and what have you. I think because of the way our news is, the next time that we do that, there'll be a large segment of the population that wouldn't even be aware of it. But there has been one recent event that has gotten worldwide sort of attention and that penetration, and that's this whole coronavirus COVID-19 thing. So we may have wanted to have the Artemis generation, but I think we're going to end up with a COVID-19 or coronavirus generation.
Yeah. And why is that? That's because it affects so many of us individually. We all know somebody that has had it. We see it on the news constantly. I mean, that's all that is on the news. I have a friend at a TV station that was going to try to get me on one of her programs, and she says, before the coronavirus, it was all about the Democratic primaries. So they didn't have time for anything but that. And then once that got behind us, I said, okay, now can we do it? Oh, it's pandemic. There's nothing but pandemic. So you're right. That are we going to be the pandemic generation? Let's hope that a vaccine comes along, that the remedies everybody's been doing, the distancing, staying at home, not touching your face, washing your hands, turns the corner, gets past the hump, and starts to improve, that we can focus on some other things. I guess that's why I was a little cynical about your march to the, in X amount of days, we're going to be on the moon. I hope you're right. I hope we get past this corona thing quickly and can start putting energy into things that are a little more positive than watching all of our friends die from, who would have thought that I could die from going to the grocery store? Just, boggles the mind.
I know. I mean, we were already pretty isolated and independent from each other. This is just kind of, I mean, we're already wary of strangers. This just
Right.
kind of really pushes over the edge. Now we're just individual pockets of humanity of ones
Right.
and twos. But, well, Alan, I feel like I could talk to you forever, actually.
I've enjoyed this. It's really nice. I would look forward to any kind of feedback you get. I forget exactly how you disseminate this. I'm sure there's some things I said that, hardcore space fans are going to say, well, he's a jerk. I can't believe he said that. I come by my opinions honestly. A 40-year career in space, in government, private sector, nonprofit organizations, media companies. So I've had a chance to see things from some different perspectives. I've had some great moments where I've been involved with tremendous team successes. I've been involved with some team failures. And so I come by my skepticism honestly, but I also come by my enthusiasm honestly. And the more I can exchange ideas with people, especially the young people, especially those people that aren't as cynical as I've become, it does nothing but improve my mood and helps me look to a brighter future as well.
I'm glad to hear that. And I hope to have a lot more enthusiasm to share with you in the next 1,700 and some odd days.
You go. You keep it up.
Well, thank you so much. Well,
All right.
I look forward to seeing you online.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.